Great Pan, God of the wild, we honour you, ruler of sky, sea and earth, light ensouling all. The world is yours, everything reflects you. Delighted by shady groves, dancer under the stars, you rule the seasons. Pan, shepherd of goats, giver of milk, meat and skin, your horns sprouted and the world began. Inspire us with dance and song, protect us from fear. You love the hunt, echo solitary song and playful nymphae. All your works reach fruition. Your rule increase. Pan, splendid as cloudless sky, sweet as fruit, obscure as the deepest cave, subtle as a snake, wise as a wolf, no man can resist your panic. You hold up the earth, you rule the restless sea, even ancient ocean, earth hugger, loves your law. Air nourishes fire, fire inspires life, even the shining blue sky loves your law. Protect and care for matter dancing everywhere. Grace us, lift us, mighty Pan, come near, excite us, give us creative power and freedom from fear. That was the Orphic hymn to Pan, and the accompanying music was, rather confusingly, a hymn to the sun, which was composed originally by Messamides of Crete and was being played on this occasion by a chap called Glenn Hoban on the panpipes. So this talk for our virtual Moot in Ipswich this month is on the great Greek god Pan himself. We'll touch on some of his mythology, some of his stories, and try to give an insight into his character, his nature, his quality, and then see the ways in which he has influenced art. He has influenced music, like the panpipes you've just heard being played. The way he has influenced poetry, influenced literature, and our changing understanding of him as the millennia have rolled on past. So back in ancient times, before the Orphic cultus came to its fruition, Pan originally was a fairly minor deity, a rural deity of the farming regions of ancient Greece, particularly centred around the mountainous regions of Arcadia, which the Arcadian Tourist Board tries to convince everyone is full of frolicking shepherds and busty shepherdesses, and is playful and fun, but in reality is a rather arid, dusty, dry region with plenty of scorpions and, once upon a time, plenty of wolves. A difficult place to live and reside, but the home of mighty Pan nonetheless. And for a long period, Pan was somewhat on the peripheries of the Olympian pantheon, regarded as a minor character, as I say, rather than some revered deity that self-respecting middle class and upper class Athenians would have turned to and reverenced, rather a god for the working classes, the peasants, the ones who farmed goats and toiled in the fields. But that began to change with the upsurge of the Orphic cult. The fact that Pan's name in Greek means everything, all, the entirety, led the devotees of the Orphic cult to see him as not some minor rural deity only worshipped by smelly shepherds, but as a cosmic figure, a central being, this entity revered and adored at the centre of the universe. He was the whole cosmos, he was everything. Pantheism comes from Pan, the worship of everything, deity in everything. He is, for the Orphics, that deity that is in everything, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. He is that central force, that entity. So very, very different understandings. And it begs some theological questions for polytheists and other types of pagan. as well as perhaps theological questions for people in different spiritual traditions. If different peoples at different points in history and perhaps different parts of the world sometimes have quite different understandings of the same deity, is it because they're all just making it up as they go along? Is it because one of them has a clear-cut vision of the deity and the other group of people are confused and deluded in some way? Is it because deities themselves are so vast, so complex, so enormous, that any one group of people at any given point in history only ever sees a small part of a deity? And like the ancient Indian tale originally told by the Jains, it said, of the 5 blind men and the elephant, who stumble into the elephant, and one of them thinks it's a stone pillar, and one of them thinks it's a bird, and one of them thinks it's a snake, and so forth, because each of the blind men holds on to a different part of the elephant, and so each understands it differently. Is our understanding of reality, of the gods, so limited that, like the blind men, we only ever see a tiny little part of it, and so we think our tiny little part is the end-all and be-all of that deity? Or, and this is the last of the ors for now, or is it because deities themselves develop and change over time? So the way a deity was understood in 5000 BCE is not necessarily the way it exists and changes and develops and reveals a new facet of itself in 1000 BCE or in 2000 CE. Because just as we as human beings change over time, I'm not the same person now as when I was 20 years old or as when I was 5 years old. So is this the case with deities, that they change, they develop, they evolve, far from being eternally perfect and eternally static the way monotheists envision deity. Perfect and unchangeable and outside of time are polytheist deities understood as being within time and therefore changeable. They evolve, they develop. Sometimes they get more complicated, perhaps sometimes they get less complicated. Is this our understanding of how deity works? So I'm not going to answer any of those possibilities, but leave you to think about which one is most in keeping with your own theology, your own understanding of what not only Pan himself is, but any deity for that matter might be, and how different people at different points in history have understood that deity. In terms of the family tree, Pan is often described by later writers, particularly once we get into the Victorian and Edwardian eras, as being somewhat fruitless in the sense of perceived as being without consort and without children or issue. There is a Greek myth which suggests that Pan was the very first person to invent masturbation and went off and taught it to others, and of course to the Victorian mind, onanism, spilling one's seed fruitlessly, particularly for male masturbation more so than female, was seen as a incipient madness. You do it too much and you'll go blind and your brain will decay. And so they kind of linked their disapproval of masturbation to this notion that Pan, for all of his chasing after shepherdesses and so forth, and shepherds, was ultimately barren. If you go back to the myths, that is not the case. There are various perceptions as to quite where his parentage lays, and it does depend whether you're taking the Orphic view of the matter or you're following one of the other mythical approaches. But Hermes is often said to be his father, with various possibilities like Penelope and Callisto as his mother, and effectively a grandson of Zeus and Maia. But he does have consorts. 2 goddesses are linked to him, Aja and Selene, the moon. Aja is the goddess by which he does have a child, Ajapan, who is a goat being much like himself, who wanders the world. So whilst many of his relationships with nymphs and naiads and dryads and what have you often end in a somewhat futile fashion, with them running away screaming and turning themselves into plants and trees and all manner of other things. At least one of his relationships did result in offspring. And so there is this contradiction to that Victorian Edwardian perception of him as a cul-de-sac in the divine hierarchy. In terms of his changing presence, changing understanding, to the distant Greeks in ancient times, he was the god of lonely, wild, abandoned places, the god of nature, the god of places largely untouched by humanity, back in the day when there were still many, many places untouched by humanity, unlike today, where we've been practically everywhere there is to go, and had an impact on just about every square inch of the planet. As such, Pan for the Greeks was not simply a god worshipped by shepherds, but a god turned to by the goats, the wolves, the bears, the creatures of the wild, the creatures of forests, the hills, the mountains, the meadows. He was a being of reverence to all life, not only human life. And a dangerous god in many respects. He could be friendly, he could be supportive to those he chose to, but equally he could induce terror, the panic, and that's where we get the word panic from, that state of abject fear induced by an encounter with Pan, particularly if you are unwise enough to go up a Greek mountain during the noonday. And this may be at least partially to do with the heat in Greek mountains in the noonday, oiling people's brains and sending them a little bit peculiar, that at noon, more than at any other time of day or night, Pan was liable to induce terror in those he encountered, with his wild, lusty, animalistic appearance. But the perception, the view of Pan has chopped and changed and developed over time, as I say, and persisted. And of course, many of you will recognise the image there of The Wind in the Willows, written by Kenneth Graham and illustrated largely by the wonderful Arthur Rackham with his watercolours. Wind in the Willows, for anyone unfamiliar with the work, is a children's story written in the early years of the 20th century. And for the most part, it is just a children's story. It's full of talking animals, chasing around, getting up to mayhem and mischief, nicking cars, impersonating washerwomen, stealing horses, doing all sorts of strange and crazy things. It's comedic, it's funny, it's well written. It's written with a level of language that assumes its child readership are educated, not the mumbling, grunting teenagers of today, perhaps, although I'm sure not all teenagers today are mumbling and grunting, but a few are. But with a sense of children with good vocabulary. And let's go back to days of having children with good vocabulary. But in Chapter 7, which is called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, a baby otter goes missing. The baby otter is called Portly, and the parents, mother and father otter, are besides themselves. They've looked here, there and everywhere, and they can't find their child. So they call upon their friends, Mole and Ratty, to help them in the search for the baby otter. And so Mole and Ratty go out paddling along the river, because Ratty is a water rat and adores the river, and Mole has developed a taste for the river through his friendship with Ratty. And in the wee small hours, as dawn is breaking, they have an encounter not only with the baby otter, whom, if you've got good eyesight, you will notice in the picture, just between the hooves of Pan, but with Pan himself. So I'm going to read you an excerpt, not the whole chapter, just an excerpt from the chapter, in which suddenly a children's story, full of all this nonsense about stealing cars and cross-dressing and what have you, suddenly has this vision of a pagan god. "This is the place of my song dream, the place the music played to me," whispered the rat, as if in a trance. "Here, in this holy place, Here, if anywhere, surely we shall find him. Then, suddenly the mole felt a great awe fall upon him, an awe that turned his muscles to water, bowed his head, and rooted his feet to the ground. It was no panic terror. Indeed, he felt wonderfully at peace and happy, but it was an awe that smote and held him. And without seeing, he knew it could only mean that some august presence was very, very near. With difficulty he turned to look for his friend, and saw him at his side, cowed, stricken and trembling violently, and still there was utter silence in the populous bird-haunted branches around them, and still the light grew and grew. Perhaps he would never have dared to raise his eyes, but that, though the piping was now hushed, the call and the summons seemed still dominant and imperious. He might not refuse were Death himself waiting to strike him instantly. Once he had looked with mortal eye on things rightly kept hidden. Trembling he obeyed, and raised his humble head, and then, in that utter clearness of the imminent dawn, while nature flushed with fullness of incredible colour, seemed to hold her breath for the event, he looked in the very eyes of the friend and helper, saw the backward sweep of the curved horns gleaming in the growing daylight, saw the stern hooked nose between the kindly eyes that were looking down on them humorously, while the bearded mouth broke into a half smile at the corners, saw the rippling muscles on the arm that lay across the broad chest, the long, supple hands still holding the panpipes, only just fallen away from the parted lips, saw the splendid curves of the shaggy limbs disposed in majestic ease on the sward, saw, last of all, nestling between his very hooves, sleeping soundly in entire peace and contentment, the little, round, podgy, childish form of the baby otter. All this he saw for one moment, breathless and intense, vivid on the morning sky, and still as he looked, he lived, and still as he lived, he wondered. "Rat!" He found breath to whisper, shaking. "Are you afraid?" "Afraid?" murmured the rat, his eyes shining with unutterable love. "Afraid? Of him? Oh, never! Never! And yet, oh mole, I am afraid." Then the two animals, crouching to the earth, bowed their heads and did worship. Sudden and magnificent, the sun's broad golden disk showed itself over the horizon facing them, and the first rays shooting across the level water meadows took the animals full in the eyes and dazzled them. When they were able to look once more, the vision had vanished and the air was full of the carol of birds that hailed the dawn. As they stared blankly in dumb misery deepening, as they slowly realized all they had seen and all they had lost, a capricious little breeze dancing up from the surface of the water tossed aspens, shook the dewy roses, and blew lightly and caressingly in their faces, and with its soft touch came instant oblivion. For this is the last, best gift that the kindly demigod is careful to bestow on those to whom he revealed himself in their helping. The gift of forgetfulness, lest the awful remembrance should remain and grow, and overshadow mirth and pleasure, and the great haunting memory should spoil all the afterlives of little animals helped out of difficulties in order that they should be happy and light-hearted as before. Now, elsewhere in Wind in the Willows, There's carol singing and church going. And so the sudden appearance of a demigod, and he is there described as a demigod, not as a fantasy or a dream state or anything like that, but an actual demigod, is curious. To the best of my knowledge, Kenneth Graham was not pagan. He had a classical education, like all well-to-do men of the time. But there, Pan introduces himself into the story, and is that the case? Carl Jung re-echoed an older sentiment that it's not so much people who have ideas, it's more ideas who have people. He didn't phrase it quite like that, but the gist, the shortened gist, is that in Jung's view, because we all partake of the collective unconscious, there are forces within the collective unconscious, demigods if you like, although that wasn't a term he was much inclined to use. And those demigods have lives of their own, separate from us. They intrude into the minds of people. They make themselves known. Did Pan want to be in Wind of the Willows, even though the rest of it is just a fun and silly children's story? Did he make himself known to Kenneth Graham in some dream that had to be committed to paper when he woke up in the morning? Or when he was sitting there clattering away at his typewriter, did the muse, this time a hairy-legged muse, seize hold of him and insist upon being upon the page, worshipped by moles and rats and otters? I like to think so. And here a kind and gentle view of Pan. But like all gods, as I say, when we talked about Panic earlier, he can be kind, but he can also be wild and dangerous, and you never know quite what mood he will be in when you encounter him, or quite how he will respond to you. So tread with caution when you tread into those sacred glades. The painting here of Pan and Syrinx by Sebastiano Ricci recounts the story of one of Pan's less successful romances, when he pursued the maiden Syrinx, and in order to get away from him and his lusty advances, she transformed herself into some reeds growing in the riverbed. But Pan was not to be outdone. He whipped out a knife, cut the reeds, or at least the top parts of them, because you never cut the whole plant, you leave the roots growing and growing, but you cut the top part of the reeds and fashioned them into a set of what would become in time known as the panpipes or the Syrinx, bearing the name of the nymph, who is the living consciousness of the reed. And so one way or another he still got his blowjob and was able to blow upon the pipes and create the first panpipe music, which has become popular the world over, not just in Greece but many other parts of the world too. It's haunting and melodic and magical, and if you want to invoke the potency of Pan, one approach, of course, if you are musically gifted, is to sit and play upon the panpipes in some wild and lonely spot. And if you're not so musically gifted, I suppose in this day and age we have the joys of things like MP3 players, where you can listen to somebody else blowing upon the pipes, and hope that when Pan appears he doesn't short-circuit your electronic devices. There are different views in myth as to how many tubes, how many reeds there are within the panpipe. Some arguing 7, some a larger number. You can get panpipes of all different sizes. But the argument favoured by the Orphics of the 7 reeds is not so much to do with notes in the musical scale. It's more the idea of the 7 reeds embodying the 7 astrological forces that were known about in ancient Greece, which is the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn and Mars. They not having the telescopic ability to see beyond Saturn at that juncture, although there is some evidence that certain cultures were aware that there were planets beyond Saturn. The notion of the 7 reeds for the 7 planets goes back to this idea as Pan as the spirit of everything, the spirit of all, that in playing upon the 7 reeds he plays upon the 7 astrological forces of our solar system, that were known of at the time at any rate. He commands the planets, in effect. He is playing, if you will, the music of the spheres. There are other views of Pan, younger views of Pan, like the child version of Faun by the artist Rita Kirkman on the screen here. And in such a Faun, Pan, child Pan, Satyr Pan, the young, frolicking, youthful Pan, crops up not so much in ancient myth but in stories. The stories of Saki, for example, where he is a force of the wild who lures the sedate and the prudish astray. I recorded that one of Saki's stories about the music of the pipes echoing from the hills, and put that up on my blog. Was it a year or so ago now, something like that. He also crops up in various other tales and accounts in sometimes youthful form and sometimes wild and frightening form, such as in the story of Arthur Machen, where he is a primal and potentially destructive force. So again and again he haunts the minds of writers, of musicians, of painters, of artists of every shape and size and variety, the good, the bad and the indifferent. Is this the choice entirely of the artist, or is this the choice of Pan himself to be known to the creative and through the creative to a wider appreciative audience? And therein is a debate about the nature of the muse and whether the artist has a vision or a vision has an artist. The cinematically inclined will recognise this as a still from the Chronicles of Narnia films. They seem to have run out of steam on producing the whole set of the books. But here we have a satyr on the forces of good, the forces of Aslan in Aslan's army, fighting in defence of the forces of good, as a reminder not only of the presence of the goat-footed in the stories of C.S. Lewis, but also that Pan himself, in one of the ancient Greek myths, was called upon to turn the tide of battle, and this he did very, very successfully, and so was honoured by the Greeks forevermore, or at least the Greeks who won, possibly not the Greeks who lost, for his military prowess, and the idea that in turning the tide of battle in favour of the Athenians, he did so by inducing terror and fear in the enemy, and panicking them at the battle, that terrorised the enemy. They all ran off, and Pan was declared the protector, the guardian, for having incited this state of wild and abject dread. And therefore, once the battle was all over and done with and the dust settled and everyone had gone back to their lives, he was honoured as the or as a deity, not the deity, but as a deity upon the Athenian slopes, because he had won the Battle of Marathon. He had terrorised the armies into fleeing, and so rather than being this rural backwater deity that he had been previously, at least in the eyes of the city-dwelling Athenians, who were a little bit snobbish and looked down their nose at the sort of rustics of the countryside, now Pan had a statue, had an altar, had a shrine in Athens itself as the protector. So there he was, or there he sat in a grotto on the northern side of the Acropolis, honoured and revered. The Sleeping Satyr, as a sculptor by Giovanni Angelo Montorsoli, is a fascinating figure. I think a particularly beautiful work of art, something to be much admired. And here is reminiscent of the myth that at roughly the time Jesus was walking the earth, sailors rounded the coast of Greece and heard a voice bellow out, a never quite identified voice, quite who it was that was saying, bellowing out that the great god Pan is dead. The sailor who heard this and reported it was a chap called Thamus, an Egyptian, but sailing with Greeks and sailing towards Greece. The voice just booms out. So it's not meant to be a voice in Thamus's head, like a kind of a dream voice. It's meant to be an actual external voice booming out across the bay that the great god Pan is dead, sleeping or dead. Take your choice there. And this was widely circulated in the rapidly converting world of Christendom in the Mediterranean as proof, as demonstration that this voice, may be an angel, maybe God, maybe some prophet, was declaring that not only was Pan dead, but by extension all of the pagan gods were now dead, to make way for Christ and to make way for the upsurge of Christianity. And therein we could have a debate in and of itself about the nature of death when it comes to deities. Not only in this occasion is Pan said to be dead, but Celtic myth, Norse myth, Greek myth, Roman myth, Egyptian myth, pretty much every myth you care to imagine has at least one, if not several, divine figures who are said to die. Sometimes they're killed in battle, sometimes they're killed by a rival god, all sorts of variations and themes, but a god who dies. And this begs the question of what do we understand by the very idea of a god who dies? Does this mean that you could take, for example, Pan's case as simply Christian propaganda and therefore not true? Or you could say, well, perhaps death here is a metaphor for sleeping, for the end of one era and the beginning of a new era. And during the new era is the god of the old era, or gods in the plural of the old era, are they sleeping in some sense? If not outright dead in the human notion of the term, but in the sense that they are sleeping, and therefore does this mean inaccessible to human worshippers? So when you contact them through prayer, all you get is an answer phone saying, Pan is unavailable at the moment, please leave a message after the tone. Beep. Or is this death in the sense that for those cultures that believe in reincarnation, the god is no longer in the form they were in, they've now died in that form and will come back in some other form, some other guise? So do gods reincarnate the way that many cultures believe humans reincarnate, shifting and moving between different forms? Could that account for the curious similarity between a number of Christian saints and a number of pagan deities, that they are reincarnations? Or are they simply political expediencies to incorporate the old era into the new to help with the process of conversion? How do we understand this? How do we perceive this? If the great god Pan is dead, well, I'd say he's certainly enjoying a very active afterlife, appearing in art and music and novels and the rituals of pagans the world over in the centuries since the days in which Thamus sailed round the coast of Greece. The picture here is a rather rough and ready work of art, unlike the very elegant works of art we've seen so far, and depicts the ritual of the pharmakoi, The pharmakoi is where we get the Greek word from which we get the modern-day word pharmacy. As in dispensers or chemists, a place of healing. The pharmakoi is a sacrificial goat, a scapegoat. And the ritual practice, which is described in various sources, is that the goat, who may or may not be dedicated to Pan, there are, I'm sure, goats in the world whose calling is to other deities besides Pan. But the goat is led around the city in an annual festivity. And there's a big parade. People put on their fine clothes, like you can see in the picture. They play musical instruments. They do all sorts of things. And they lead the goat in parade, and people come out of their houses and they sing and they dance in the streets, and they no doubt have a bit of ouzo and retsina and what have you. And they decorate the goat with ribbons and with flowers and with all sorts of things. And they're meant to, as they're decorating this goat, they're meant to let go of all of their angers, their guilts, their resentments, their fears, their blames and their shames, and place them on the goat, who, once it's done the tour of the city, gone round the, if not every single street in the city, at least maybe the main roads that crisscross the city, they then go to the city gates, bearing in mind that most cities at this day and age were surrounded by large walls with gates, and you had to enter the city, you had to go through the gate. Protection from hostile forces and so on. And once they reach the city gate, they open the gates very formally, a few prayers and so forth, and then, instead of sacrificing the goat, as might be expected at this juncture, they release the goat to go outside the city, and then the goat just wandered off to wherever on earth it was the goat wanted to wander off to, up into the hills and the mountains and the woods and where have you, never to be seen again. So the goat would take with it all of the blame and the shame and the guilt of the city. It was the scapegoat, the one who takes the blame for others. And obviously this you can understand incorporated into Christian imagery, Christ dying for the sins of other people as a kind of a scapegoat figure. There are other religions which also have figures who take on board the sins, the shames, the guilts, the dark impulses of others, and it becomes a sort of purifying cleansing ceremony by which people relinquish that which they are unwilling to admit to in themselves, at least not in public anyway. And so we can understand, even though this is just a goat rather than a living embodiment of Pan himself, that Pan takes on a role through his goatiness in being a figure of blame, a figure of shame, and I'll come back to that idea momentarily, because I want to suggest that he still is, in many respects, a cultural figure of blame, a scapegoat for the deeds of others. But before we get on to that, a little bit more classical art, The Contest of Pan and Apollo, by Laurits Tuxen. So back to high art again here. The story goes that when King Midas, he of the golden touch, had been cured of his golden touch and had got sick of all of the greed and corruption and the silliness and pretense of the royal courts, hied himself off to rural life. Now, this doesn't mean he just kind of became Farmer Giles, because he was still a very rich man, so he had people to till the fields for him. But he lived in a villa, basically, in the Greek countryside, and instead of wearing a crown, took to wearing a Phrygian cap, that red hat, which you can see one of the figures on the left, the one with the white hair, sitting behind Pan, wearing. That is King Midas, no longer possessed of goat's ears. Donkey's ears, rather, I should say. The Phrygian cap was a symbol of a freed man, a freed slave, and is perhaps arguably where we get the idea of the gnomes wearing little red hats like that, and perhaps where the Santa Claus hat comes from may also be the Phrygian cap, because it was a popular thing to wear at Saturnalia in ancient Rome. So normally it was worn by an ex-slave to signify that he or she was no longer a slave, that they were now a freed person. But in this sense, Midas is wearing it to say that he is free from the travails and the boredoms and the priggishness of the Greek court. He's a free man. He's kind of left his burdens and his duties behind and wandered off into the countryside. And part of his wandering off into the countryside was that he fell in love with the music of the rural people. So having heard lots of high-blown court music as his life as a king, he's now living in the sticks and going to the local tavernas and swigging a bit of Retzinger and singing along to all the bawdy songs that the country folk sing along to. The music of Pan, in essence. So not only the lonesome romantic music of the Syrinx, but also the bawdier music of the taverns. And Midas, ever one for a bit of bragging, has gone around saying to people how wonderful and fantastic Pan's music is. He's become a devotee of Pan, a worshipper of Pan, and saying this is the best music in the world, there isn't anything to compare to it, which is never a wise thing to say in ancient Greece because it smacks of hubris when you claim one thing is supremely better than any other. Some god somewhere is likely to get a little bit irked. And in this occasion it was Apollo who got a little bit irked. The very nearly naked figure sitting there on the right hand side of the portrait with golden hair is Apollo. And Apollo comes down and says to King Midas, "How very dare you suggest that this country bumpkin music is better than the wonderful, elegant tunes of the court which I have inspired, for my lyre is better than Pan's pipes." And so they decide to have a musical contest, and they need a judge who is neutral, so they call upon Molus, the god of the mountain, who is the old man in the middle with a white beard. And Molus comes down from the mountain, because if you can't go to the mountain will come to you. And he becomes the Simon Cowell figure in this Greece has talent contest. So Pan plays his pipes, and a wonderful, amazing song it is, and the whole countryside is dancing to it, and it tears the soul. And then Apollo plays his lyre, and again the music is wonderful and fabulous and beautiful, and people are weeping with joy at the music. And Molus, the mountain, must judge. And in a voice slower than the speech of an ent, Molus says that Apollo's music is indeed better, is indeed wondrous. And so Apollo wins the day. The contest is his. And Midas is rather embittered by this and feels cast aside, and Pan is now too chuffed. And there's a little bit more to the story, but we'll leave it there for the moment, and suggest that maybe what we're seeing here is a kind of a country versus city clash. Is the culture of the city better than the culture of the country? And obviously on this occasion the culture of the city triumphs. And a reminder that paganism is not just about life in the country. Paganism in ancient times was also about the life of the city and the gods of the city and the gods of art and lore and music and culture and sort of sophisticated things, as well as the gods of forests and mountains and rivers and wild animals and so forth. And the need for balance between the two. Is this an Orphic reflection on two aspects of human nature? The wilder, more naturalistic, more animalistic side of Pan, and the cerebral, intellectual, highbrow aspect of Apollo. And so not quite the way Nietzsche phrased it as Dionysus clashing with Apollo, but here Pan clashing with Apollo. The rural versus the intellectual, perhaps, or shall we say the passionate versus the intellectual. And in this occasion, at least, the intellectual triumphs as being the superior force, the superior trait. At least it is in the eyes of Molus. Whether everyone would agree with that, I suppose, is a moot point for discussion. But that's how the Greek tellers of tales and myths left it, that whilst Pan is wonderful, Apollo has the edge. sticking with these rather Orphic understandings, Pan was also known by two rather grand titles: Panphage-Pangenitor, Panphage the all-consumer, the all-eater, the all-destroyer; Pangenitor the all-creator, the all-begetter. So, very grand titles for what was, theoretically at least, a minor rural deity, and suggestive of that cosmic view of the Orphics, that he was like Vishnu in Hindu mythology, both the creator and the destroyer, the beginning and the end, the one who shapes the universe, the one who tears the universe down again, in order for it to be reborn and reborn and reborn. This constant phoenix-like cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Which brings us back to the scapegoat. Because obviously the image of Pan became used within Christianity as an image of the devil, an image of Satan. The Bible itself gives very little visual description for anyone. The devil is never directly described. We have a description of Lucifer, which describes him as being colossally tall and covered in eyes, which is one of the reasons why the Yazidi people talk of him as the peacock angel, because sort of the eyes on the peacock's fan, or tail. The same biblical references talk about angels as being spinning wheels covered in eyes, which just sounds beyond surreal. He's certainly never referenced, either Lucifer or Satan is never referenced in the Bible as having hooves or goat's furry legs or horns. So this is entirely an image from Greek myth, entirely the image of Pan that's been shunted into later Christian iconography. Because you can, if you want to do a bit of an art historian trip, you can look at paintings, wall friezes, sculptures, what have you, over the centuries, or millennia in Christianity, and see how depictions of the devil change quite radically over time, just as depictions of Christ change quite radically over time. Why did the early Christians, well, I say early, we're getting towards the end of the first millennia, really. Why did they start drawing on the image of Pan when they wanted a visual representation in paintings and sculptures and whatnot for what Satan looks like? Why did they go down that route? Well, as a suggestion, Pan, what is he to the Greek mind? He is lust, passion, desire. He is wildness. He is nature. He is sexual urges. He is self-pleasuring, sensual. All of those things, to the very ascetically minded priesthood in Christianity during its first 1,000 years, let alone the second 1,000 years, but certainly the first 1,000 years, all of those things were dark and dangerous and frightening. They were concerned about sex as a temptation to lead the holy astray, to lead people into adultery and premarital sex and masturbation and homosexuality and all sorts of other things. And of course Pan is as much one for chasing after shepherd boys as shepherd girls. He is an embodiment of the very things that Christianity in its first 1,000 years was particularly terrified of, especially after Augustine gets into his stride. And Augustine's theology takes such a dominant influence within the Catholic Church, particularly more so than the Orthodox Church or the much later Protestant and dissident movements. Augustine had, before he converted to Christianity, had a brief flirtation with the Manichaean religion. And the Manichaean religion is a weird combination, a kind of a rolling stone that gathers bits of everybody else's theology as it rolls along. The Manichaeans believed that the universe was split between two forces, the king of light and the king of dark. The king of dark was all that is evil and terrible and destructive and wicked, and the king of light all that is good and beautiful and wonderful and magnificent. The king of dark created the material world. The king of light created the spirit world. So everything of the material world, flesh and blood and rock and water and wood, all of the manifestations of material reality that we experience through our five senses are creations of the king of darkness. They are creations of evil. So to the Manichaeans, the physical world, eating, drinking, wearing nice clothes, having sex, all of the things of the physical world are wicked. They are creations of the force of evil, and they are temptations away from the realm of spirit. So the truly good, the elect, must focus ascetically on the world of spirit, not upon the evils of the fleshly realms. A lot of them, particularly the priesthood, became vegetarian because they believed it was wrong to eat animals, not because they were concerned about animal cruelty and welfare or anything like that, but because they did not want to eat anything that was conceived through sex. And so they took the approach that plants don't have sex, which we now know is perhaps a misunderstanding with modern views of botany, but at the time they perceived plants as not having sex, at least not in the animal way of having sex at any rate. There were some strange sects around at the time who also believed that fish didn't have sex, and so it was okay to eat fish because they reproduced in some very mystical way that didn't involve sex at all. But that's a very minor sideline view. So therefore, to have sex, to bring anyone else through, children, babies, into the world, to bring them through the gate of the flesh into the world was a dark and deadly thing to do. It's one of the reasons why once the Manichaean doctrine through Augustine started to spread such a strong influence within the church, you had the increasing relegation of women to the sidelines, not only through the story of Eve succumbing first to temptation before Adam and leading Adam astray, but the notion that women through the womb were the gateway to the flesh. It's how the spirit entered the realm of flesh. And rather than seeing this as a wonderful thing, it was seen as a terrible thing because the spirit had fallen from the realms of goodness into the realms of wickedness, into the realms of flesh. And it did so via the gateway of the mother's womb. And so women began to get an even harder time of it than men were getting. And men were certainly themselves also getting a hard time for being lustful and full of desires and passions and not able to keep it in their pants and so on. Women got an even bigger stick for the same thing. And so if you're looking around for a scapegoat image, an image that embodies passion and lust and desire, that embodies chasing after beautiful women, chasing after beautiful men, playing with yourself up a great mountainside, that embodies pleasure of music, which is enjoyed through the ears, and therefore that obviously is a sin because it's part of the flesh, which embodies a love of good wine, a love of animals, of nature, of all things physical, all things material, then who better to use as your scapegoat than Pan? And so it becomes perhaps understandable, at least I think it becomes understandable, that the Christian church saw Pan as the ideal visual hook on which to depend their notion of what the devil looked like. And so poor old Pan has been carrying the guilts and the burdens not only of the Vatican and Christianity in general, but all peoples, you could argue, who are brought up within a Christian culture with Christian values that are permeated by these old hangover beliefs from previous eras. That sort of prudishness, that resentment and fear of sex and desire and passion, of the natural world and all things to do with the natural world, the perception of them as gateways to sin and corruption, rather than as spiritual things to be celebrated in and of themselves. But not everyone has thought so. That's what's left of the Painswick Folly in Gloucester. Back in the 1750s, there are records of the lord of the manor having a large statue of Pan in his garden. Nothing unusual in that. Lots of people, rich people, did at that period in history. But there was an annual festival, a parade through town, in which they carried the statue of Pan. Presumably they put it back in his garden at the end of the day, but they carried the statue of Pan through the town as part of this big parade. And it was led, the parade, by the vicar, which I find really rather entertaining and delightful. It smacks somewhat, doesn't it, of the Wicker Man movie with the big parade through town. Eventually it was put an end to when the old vicar died and a new vicar was appointed to the parish, and he wouldn't have none of it. Put an end to all that parading nonsense, and therefore the statue of Pan was plonked back in the Lord of the Manor's garden, and there it stayed. And I believe is no longer in existence. I don't know what happened to it. But an unusual example from the 1700s of a community with the support of the local church, if not, I don't know what the bishop thought, if even the bishop knew, but at least the support of the local vicar in celebrating Pan, celebrating nature. We also have poems by Byron and Shelley and various people celebrating Greek myth. Oscar Wilde churns out a huge number of poems inspired by Greek myth, including the figure of Pan as a regular character who crops up in his art, his poems and his art and so on. Byron is referred to as having on his country estate an altar held to Pan. Now, whether that was him just being a posh boy having a bit of a sort of whimsy where he'd go along and pretend to worship before Pan, or whether it was a genuine spiritual conviction and he really did believe in Pan as a spiritual presence and really did make offerings to him before an altar, we can't be wholly sure, although Byron's lifestyle seems to lend itself very much to ancient Greek wildness and whimsy. But a little more poetry before we are completely done. There's an example of at least a couple of verses from the poetry of the day. This is Shelley's Hymn to Pan. From the forests and highlands we come from the river-girt islands, where loud waves are dumb, listening to my sweet pipings, the wind in the reeds and the rushes, the beads on the bells of time, the birds on the myrtle bushes, the cicale above in the lime, and the lizards below in the grass, were as silent as ever old Molus was, listening to my sweet pipings. Liquid Peneus was flowing, and all dark Tempe lay in Palian shadow outgrowing the light of the dying day. Speeded by my sweet pipings, the Silene and Sylvans and Fauns, and the nymphs of the woods and the waves, to the edge of the moist river lawns, and the brink of the dewy caves, and all that did then attend and follow, were silent with love, as you now, Apollo, with envy of my sweet pipings. So a recollection to the myth we were talking about earlier. The poem goes on somewhat longer than that, but that's just a couple couple of verses there. So, did the great god Pan die? Or did he just take a holiday and then come back fully refreshed, reborn, revitalised, appealing to generations of new people? People who were at least nominally Christian, but drawn to worship of the ancient and the old, to see the positive in Pan rather than only the negative. Or is this all just wishful thinking and whimsy? Who can say? C.S. Lewis himself embraced the image of Pan through the joyful figure of Mr. Tumnus. And who could complain about Mr. Tumnus? That laughing, twisting, turning, delightful figure, bringing music and magic into the lives of children, and inspiring a poem of my own, which I'll read to you now, called The Song of Mr. Tumnus, which takes a slightly different approach to the theme of Narnia. 100 years of winter, so it felt. Once limber branches grow numb and splinter like life frozen, unchanging. Jadis solitary the table cleaves, songless woods sepulchral stand, leached of hope fallen with the leaves, vain skeletons spiralling into mulch. All that was once held so dear, decayed and dissipated. We few survivors, tired with fear, would Aslan's roar echo, promise throughout the world? No lion's thunder stirred me. It was your greeting that unfurled, softly spoken, shivering up my spine, dissolving a century of snow, letting our songs entwine, quiet but richly echoing, in forest vaults strong. Arterial lust calling me back from death, sighing a Syrinx song. No lions panting, but your breath upon my nape melted the Gorgon's indifferent gaze and granted our escape. Warmth flowed to your touch, colour blossoming. I took your hand and we danced up the spring. Sometimes you leading, sometimes I, trampling winter's sting, the lion heat of summer cannot come till first Tumnus, tumescent, quenches his forgotten thirst. Goat boy you called me, and so I am. No son of Adam I, but a child of Pan. I tell a different story, neglected by the spawn of man. And I could go off onto a rant here about how Mr. Tumnus, understandably enough, given that it's a children's film, has no nether regions, nor even a jockstrap to suggest he has nether regions, just as an increasingly large amount of modern-day pagan art depicting Pan depicts him more like some simpering pop star, pretty boy with no appendage. We have now castrated Pan, eunuch Pan, sexless, sweet, twee, inoffensive Pan, like sweet, twee, inoffensive Mr. Tumnus, robbed of that very root of urge and passion that makes Pan what Pan is, that makes him instead palatable to modern-day audiences. And I'd like to suggest the modern-day audiences aren't just children going to see C.S. Lewis films, whom you can understand not wanting an eyeful, but even a lot of people who consider themselves modern pagans often are rather sedate and desexualized, and not simply desexualized, but even taking away Pan as the figure of panic, a figure of wildness, a figure of risk and danger. This tendency to want everything safe and anodyne and trite is a problem of the modern age, not just for pagans, but for so many other people too. We've got too used to safety, and it's not always a good thing. We need a bit of the wild, a bit of the dangerous, a bit of the risque. And there finally is an image that's found on a bank in Bury St Edmunds, where I work, depicting Pan, still present in the modern age, surrounded by musical instruments. Pan of the arts, Pan of music, Pan of the wild creativity, frenzied creativity, you might say. And Pan is much present in Suffolk as he is anywhere else. And I could have put up some pictures of fawns from what's left of the old pub we used to meet in. But the state of the building these days is so ill-kempt and decayed. I can't imagine those little satyrs that decorate the brewery tap pub are likely to be in existence much longer, so I'll stick with this one instead. And finish, you'll be relieved to hear, with 3 verses from one of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems entitled A Musical Instrument. What was he doing, the great god Pan, down in the reeds by the river? Spreading ruining and scattering ban, splashing and paddling with hooves of a goat, and breaking the golden lilies afloat with the dragonfly on the river. He tore out a reed, the great god Pan, from the deep cool bed of the river. The limpid water turbidly ran, and the broken lilies a-dying lay, and the dragonfly had fled away ere he brought it out of the river. High on the shore sat the great god Pan, while turbidly flowed the river, and hacked and hewed as a great god can, with his hard bleak steel at the patient reed, till there was not a sign of a laid indeed, to prove it fresh from the river. So, all honour to Pan. Light some incense to him, please, if you are so inclined, and the next time you're walking in wild and strange places, keep an ear open for the sound of hoofbeats and lilting music. I owe Pan.